think back to the essay that you read about annoying things people do with sources by Stedman, he says that your treatment of sources is important because of what it signals to your audience. Specifically, and this is a quote from Stedman, he says, when this frustrated reader, or the reader who might be reading your essay and then thinking that you are not using quotations or citation effectively. When this frustrated reader walks away from your work trying to figure out, say, why you use so many quotations or why you kept starting and ending paragraphs with them, she may come to the same conclusions I do about slow drivers. 1. You don't know the generally accepted practices of using sources, especially in academic writing in the US, or you know the guidelines but don't care. And it will be a lot harder for readers to take you seriously if they think you're ignorant or rude. So again, moving back to the discussion of controlling your sources, remember that it's important to control your sources because it's what your audience expects of you, and it signals to your audience that you know what you're doing, so it builds your credibility. Stedman, in his essay on using sources, says that a best practice for quotations is to prepare, quote, and analyze. Another way to think of Stedman's suggestion is to think of it as a quotation sandwich. And I'm going to give you an example here to show you what a quotation sandwich can do for integrating quotations. So here's an example of what Graff and Bernstein, in a book called They Say, I Say, calls hit and run quotations, and what Stedman, in the essay that you read for class, calls armadillo roadkill. Susan Bordeaux writes about women and dieting. Fiji is just one example. Until television was introduced in 1995, the islands had no reported cases of eating disorders. In 1998, 3 years after programs from the United States and Britain began broadcasting there, 62% of girls surveyed reported dieting. I think Bordeaux is right. Another point Bordeaux makes is, there are a few problems with the way that this direct quotation beginning with Fiji is integrated. Here are just a few of the problems. Number 1, we don't know who Susan Bordeaux is in this case. She writes about women and dieting, but this could mean anything from she writes for Cosmo about women and dieting, like Cosmo magazine, or it could mean that she's a scholar in the field focused on feminist issues and eating disorders. So there's such a broad range there that we really don't have a good idea where she falls on that continuum. Secondly, I find it quite difficult from the integration of this quote to figure out what point Bordeaux is making exactly. Fiji is just one example of what? It's unclear because there isn't quite enough context for me to fully understand this quote. Thirdly, this author says, I think Bordeaux is right, and then moves directly on to another point that Bordeaux makes. It's interesting that this author thinks that Bordeaux is right, but we need much more analysis here, helping us decide what from this quote was significant and discussing how this quote fits in with the rest of this author's argument. And then finally, this is a direct quote, and depending on the source, I expect to see at least some page numbers in a parenthetical citation in text. And right now, I don't see any parenthetical citation here at all, which makes me curious. Let's look at a revised example, taking into account the quotation sandwich method. So here's a new example. The feminist philosopher Susan Bordeaux deplores the hold that Western obsession with dieting has on women. Her basic argument is that increasing numbers of women across the globe are being led to see themselves as fat and in need of a diet. Citing the island of Fiji as a case in point, Bordeaux notes that, until television was introduced in 1995, the islands had no reported cases of eating disorders. In 1998, 3 years after programs from the United States and Britain began broadcasting there, 62% of girls surveyed reported dieting. Bordeaux's point is that the West's obsession with dieting is spreading even to remote places across the globe. Ultimately, Bordeaux complains, the culture of dieting will find you regardless of where you live. Bordeaux's research complements Jameson's study, mentioned earlier, and illustrates how eating disorders are becoming a pandemic. So here, notice how we've solved the problems from the previous example. There's enough information here to discuss who Susan Bordeaux is. Now I know she's a feminist philosopher. I also know how she generally feels towards dieting. I know her basic argument in the essay being discussed. I know how Fiji fits into that argument. And notice that the quote has been truncated in order to better fit within a sentence. So that quote now becomes woven into this paragraph rather than just dropped in. Notice how the quote begins in the middle of a sentence that is already that's already been written by the author. That is a much more sophisticated mode of including a quotation, blending a quotation with your own words, rather than simply dropping in a quote from another source. Notice also that there is now an in-text citation, including the page numbers where Bordeaux's quote can be found. And finally, notice that there is a discussion of what is most important from the quote. Specifically, the discussion here restates the quote's main point and explains how this main point fits in with the rest of this author's argument. So, moving back to Stedman's best practices for including quotes, he says to prepare your reader, include your quotation, and then analyze your quotation. In other words, use a quotation sandwich where the bread is to prepare and analyze, and the quote is in the middle, like the meat or the veggies if you're a vegetarian. Another way to think of this is that quotations work best when they are sandwiched in between your own ideas and your own voice. This is one way to avoid the stuff about X paper, making sure that quotations are always controlled by your own voice. To do this, first prepare. Introduce your author if this is the first time you've quoted him or her, along with any credentials that might help us understand why you bothered with this source. You don't always need every credential that makes a source credible as you're introducing them. Instead, include only the most important credentials. Be brief. Secondly, you introduce your quote. Be sure to use an in-text citation immediately after your quote. Blend the quote with your own language by inserting it into a sentence that you control. Review the quotation grammar rules. As I was reading some of your summaries, I realized that quotation grammar rules will be important for you as you revise. You can find a link to quotation grammar rules under resources on Blackboard. Once you've concluded your quote, analyze. This is possibly the most important part of using direct quotations. Rarely leave the quotation to do the work of connecting itself to your ideas. Comment on the quotation and how you want your readers to understand it. What's it got to do with your paper anyway?